back, everybody. This is the second episode of On the Right Track. Today we're going to talk about wound healing, wound care. Because as physical therapists, we are actually, we can get specialized in the act of wound care. And so part of that is learning about wound care in our integumentary class. And so we just want to share the top contour of what we're learning with y'all.
Mm-hmm. So wounds don't necessarily have to be like open wounds. It can be just any sort of tissue damage, and there's a certain process that your body goes through in order to heal normally. So we're going to end up talking about the 3 phases of healing. We're going to talk about how you can treat different injuries and how you can address them at what stage, and what happens when you get something called chronic inflammation or abnormal healing that's not healing in the appropriate amount of time. So, Carter, what you got?
Yeah, we started out with hemostasis. So this is for really an open wound when you have active bleeding.
This is the first stage.
The first stage, right? And this lasts up to what you'd say immediately, depending on how fast the clot forms.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these things called platelets in your bloodstream, and they kind of stick together like, what would you say, like pieces of cotton candy or something?
Yeah, the sciencey term is aggregate, but really they just when they're exposed to the air, they change their enzyme activity and they bind to each other, and they close up that open wound. And that doesn't necessarily have to be like an open break in the skin. It can happen like underneath your skin. Any sort of tissue damage that you have is going to have that hemostasis process.
Yeah, so that's the primary effect of that is just to stop the bleeding. It's not really for a healing purpose, and actually to begin healing, you have to break down that clot. Then you move into the next phase of inflammation, so that's the inflammatory phase, and that can last up to 3 to 4 days, and some things I've seen up to 10 days. And if
it depends on what tissue it is, how severe it is, and if you were exposed to infections or any foreign bodies.
Right. Yeah, and depending on the severity, it could be pathological. So that means if that process goes spoiled, and it can last up to 30 days plus, that's when we get involved. So if you have a wound that's open and is not healing correctly, that would be when you should see a physician.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we can start before that too, but when it gets to that point, we really need professional help, because if you weren't able to heal right the first time normally, then you probably need to seek some sort of professional help to.
So what does normal look like for this phase?
For the inflammatory phase, typically you have a little bit of swelling, redness around what's called the peri-wound, like the borders of the actual injury themselves, and that's because you get a vascular response. You get normally at first you get vasoconstriction to slow down the amount of fluid that gets to the tissue injury, and that's so that you can actually perfuse better. Since the fluid is there for longer, it has more time to diffuse through the vessels to that injured tissue. And then after that happens, you get vasodilation, and that's so that you can have your body's immune response target any foreign bodies in that wound,
right,
or any dead tissue, because once the tissue is injured, once it's damaged, the body has to clear it out, almost like you're clearing land for a house. You have to make sure it's all out of the way so that you can flatten it out and lay the foundation.
I like the analogy of the house. If you imagine in the hemostasis before that happened, a tornado ran through and ripped off the roof of your house or tore open your skin.
Mm-hmm.
And so the inflammatory response is basically just you have your white blood cells going and eating chairs and different dirt bikes that are in your house that shouldn't be there. And so they're just slowly removing that, cleaning everything out that's not supposed to be there. And then after that, we go to the proliferative phase. And so this is basically where you build your roof of your house back.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on how deep it is, superficial wounds can heal, I think, up in 10 days, about 10 days.
Yeah, Like,
and then
yeah, the less intense it is and the less surface area it is, the shorter it's going to be.
and the deeper, more irregular wounds can take up to like 8 weeks, depending on severity.
Yeah. Typically, it should take like 20 days.
Yeah.
And again, it depends on how deep, like what tissues are affected, stuff like that.
And so what your wound is supposed to look like in this phase is like red meat, essentially.
Yeah.
It's called granulation tissue. And that means
This is for an open wound.
for an open wound of full depth.
Yeah. Like it goes past what's called the dermis. So you have 2 layers of skin, epidermis, dermis. Don't really need to know that. If you have like a really red looking, like almost hamburger meat looking wound, you probably went past those 2 layers. So
What's
4
cool,
stages.
What's cool about that, I was going to say the granulation tissue, is when it buds on top of it, those white potato bud looking things,
Oh yeah.
that becomes your dermis.
Yeah.
So it's important to protect that, or it becomes your epidermis, right?
Are you talking about granulation or
The
epithelialization?
granulation is the red beefy material, and then on top of that, the white buds become your epidermis, I believe. I think I misspoke.
So I think my understanding was granulation. It's almost like a greenish gel-like substance that occurs, and that's like new cells starting to lay collagen.
And it becomes your dermis.
And then epithelialization, the next step,
Right.
is those little white skin buds that occur.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah. And that's when you have the edges of the wound start to migrate towards each other, and then when they meet each other, that's when they stop migrating. So that's my understanding of epithelialization. Basically, just the good cells move towards each other and form that roof. Granulation is more so like laying,
The foundation.
foundation.
And then while that's happening, we also have angiogenesis, and that's just a fancy word for new blood vessels to provide your tissue with oxygen. Because without oxygen, you're at risk for a whole bunch of stuff, which we'll get into a little later. But all of these processes are kind of happening in unison and overlay each other.
Yeah, they're not all happening at once, because you also get angiogenesis, I think. So whenever you have injury to that tissue, the blood vessels also get destroyed, especially if they get to that second layer, that dermis level. So angiogenesis is just the new formation of blood vessels. This is if you're continuing the house analogy, it's your plumbing. You gotta have good plumbing to get water to the site, fluids to the site, nutrients to the site. So those new blood vessels bud off of existing blood vessels. So that's also part of the proliferative phase, that third phase.
And that can last up to 20 days, that whole phase.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens after that is also extremely important if you want that tissue to heal strong. So that's kind of where we come in, like the remodeling and maturation phase. We can do some cool techniques like cross fiber massage for scar tissue to increase the tensile strength of your new dermis and epidermis, and really tissue can heal up to as strong, 80% of the normal 100% strength of the tissue before the burn or the wound happened, which is pretty impressive. But that's like a maximum. You'll never get 100% strength
if it's scar tissue. Yeah. So really the important part to me in that phase is reorienting the fibers in a certain direction, because collagen, that second layer, it's supposed to be rigid, and basically if it's not oriented the right way, the rigidity of that tissue is compromised. It's going to be less than that 80%. So our job at that phase is to make sure that instead of collagen likes to just grow in random formations, so our job is to help put it in. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it looks like a bowl of spaghetti noodles, and then you can crossfire massage against it, and hopefully that lattice structure is more like a straight spaghetti noodle.
Yeah, because it's adaptable in the way. How you stress it is going to affect the orientation of the tissue. And you want to orient it while it's healing, because after that remodeling phase, it becomes incredibly hard to actually reorient that tissue. It's not impossible, it's just really, really hard.
An interesting implication of that is these people who have upwards of, 60-70% of their tissue scarred, like hypertrophy scar tissue, keloids, they're kind of like in a suit of armor, I think is the analogy people use. They can't move because they hadn't created that flexibility when the tissue was healing. So they got stuck in a position, so there's no normal movement for them anymore because they hadn't made that change while they could.
Yeah, we always talk about like the stability mobility spectrum in PT, and I think that applies to this remodeling phase. Basically, the more stable or rigid a structure becomes, the less mobile it becomes. So when you get those hypertrophic scars, those keloid scars, and so hypertrophic scars just means like it's growing like more than it should, but it stays within the actual injury site. And then keloid scars, it's almost, I think if I remember, it was almost an autoimmune response where the scarring goes beyond the original wound site. But basically, because now you have this more rigid and overgrowth structure of collagen, that tissue site becomes less mobile. And you want balance. You want balance with everything.
And so we have the full phase, that was the full 4 phases, and now that we know what normal should be, how do we optimize that through nutrition and sleep, and what are the things that we can actually do to improve the prognosis of those wounds?
Well, first, wound care. Like, you want to make sure you're taking care of that wound. Making sure if it's an open wound, you're keeping it covered, you're keeping it warm, making sure it's moist. Like, a common misconception is that you want to keep it open and dry, and that way you don't get infection. It's the opposite's true. You want it warm, moist, and covered. And then you want to make sure you're changing those dressings. If not every 24 hours, I'd say every 48 hours. And then we're looking for dead necrotic tissue and removing that tissue. If you're not sure what that looks like, I would take it to either your PT or your first primary care provider, and they can debride it for you.
And when you do a dressing change, it's really important that you're not pulling out healthy tissue with that.
Yeah.
And so we have not gone over how to do that, but I think I read the book.
I used to be a combat medic, so I have done some debridements before.
From my perception is you cut the bandage open, you don't tear it, you don't tug it, you cut it open so that you're not creating friction in that wound. And so when you do debridement, which is basically removing the necrotic infected tissue, you're trying to get as selective as you can because you want the healthy granulation tissue, what's going to become your new skin cells. You want them to be able to get oxygen, get blood, and not be ripped off with friction when you're doing that process.
But I mean, not only that, but like if you're taking away too much, you're basically re-injuring that tissue. So that's going to take you longer into those stages of healing and start causing what's called chronic inflammation. That chronic inflammation is due to like any sort of repeated stress. So it doesn't have to be from changing the wound. Like if you're doing some sort of activity that's provoking that tissue from healing, you're going to get into those chronic stages.
Activity is important, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
Because I want to talk a little bit about oxygen because it's super important.
Right.
And so there is one doctrine of healing where like you want to reintroduce blood flow through the vertebra and the arteries to optimize healing, but that's for any tissue.
Right.
But for wounds specifically, they need oxygen, and there is a correlation. If you don't have oxygen to that tissue, your white blood cells don't have enough oxygen to feed them while they're eating the dirt bikes and stuff in your house. And so for that reason, we do a lot of exercise with people with chronic wounds because we would like more perfusion in those limbs.
Mm-hmm. So, like, if I had to pick one sort of exercise that would have a huge impact on tissue healing, it would be like cardiovascular conditioning, something that you can do for sustained amounts of time that's going to increase your angiogenesis, increase the amount of blood vessels that's getting to that tissue, increase the amount of blood flow to that tissue. Is going to have the biggest impact on your healing. You were talking about oxygenation to the site. Actually, like when I was in my undergrad, we had our professor that she was doing studies on hyperbaric chambers and tissue healing. When, like, the impacts of hyperbarics on tissue healing, like, this is a big tangent, but they found that they could decrease the wound healing time like significantly. It went from like 30 days to like 10.
Wow.
To like full wound healing.
That's awesome.
It was incredible. So it's really expensive because it's a hyperbaric chamber, but super exciting stuff to see. And they're like new studies. Her name's Judy Wilson, so if you want to look her up,
yeah,
she's doing some cool stuff.
Sounds awesome. But what are some things that we could do depending on where the wound location is? I have like compression socks to bring fluid back. So if you have edema and other things that can block blood flow to the wound, you want to get that back to the heart pump, and so to recirculate that fluid in other places so we can get that oxygenation.
Yeah.
And ankle pumps can do that because there's a concept that we like to take for granted, the muscle pump. And so your veins, the only way you can move fluid through them is gravity and the muscle pump mechanism. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a wound at your foot, you would like to contract your big calf muscle because that shoots the blood through the veins back to your heart.
Yeah. And that's another thing we didn't talk about was inflammation and edema. If it goes beyond that inflammation phase, then you're probably starting to look at chronic inflammation. Like, you should really only have inflammation in the inflammation phase, those first 3 to 4 days of wound healing. And like you talked about, if it's going beyond that, you want to start doing some exercise intervention or some other sort of interventions that's going to help reduce the amount of swelling and get it back into your systemic circulation.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, they don't want to go to the hospital, but they really should, especially, we'll talk about, I think there's a term, epipily or whatever, where the skin folds over itself. Mm-hmm. You really need supervision from a professional physician to help, because your wound thinks it's closed when really it's just closed in on itself and it hasn't fully protected itself from infection.
Yeah. We talked about how, like, when the epithelialization occurs in the proliferative phase, the cells try to move towards each other, and then when they meet each other, they're like, okay, we're done growing. But epipily is, they start growing downward, especially in like deeper wounds. They start growing downward, and then they kind of like loop around, and they attach to themselves, and then they're like, okay, I'm done healing because they found more skin tissue. So how do we treat that? We don't. But basically they're going to try to open it back up so that the growth comes back together. Or you might have to have some sort of surgical intervention depending on how bad it's gotten,
right,
how big the wound is.
So I think we're here to talk a little bit about the lifestyle interventions, which are my favorite. Mm-hmm. First off is nutrition. So we talked about that granulation tissue. It's really made of collagen and protein. Which is,
collagen is a protein.
In order to produce those building blocks, your body needs to be fed those building blocks through your diet, right? And so it's really important to get a high protein diet when you have a burn or a wound. I would argue normal, healthy people should have a high protein diet anyways. But so like 1 gram per pound of body weight is plenty for a healthy person. Obviously, if you do have an active wound, talk to your physician about your protein intake. With that is fluid, because hydration. Because if you have an open wound, you're at risk for evaporation. I think 5x the normal fluid loss in some cases.
I think that's more so with burns.
Right.
You do lose more fluid with an open wound or tissue injury in general, because especially in that inflammatory phase, when you get that vasodilation and all the components of your blood is leaking out and trying to remove dead tissue, fight foreign bodies, and what's it called? Feed nutrients to the site.
Right.
You're losing all of that blood volume. So the more you can increase your blood volume and increase the amount of blood flow from your heart to your systemic system, the better. So hydration is key, in my opinion.
Yeah, so we're going to eat well, we're going to hydrate, and further, when we build tissue, when do we do that the most? When we sleep, right? And so it's important we're getting quality sleep, and that's because your hormones play an essential role in the anabolic, or when you build your tissues. That happens mostly when you sleep. That's because we release growth hormone, which signals for the growth of all tissues, but
not just muscle mass.
Not just muscle mass.
Yeah.
So if you have a wound, you should be sleeping about 7.5 to 8.5 hours to optimize the release of growth hormone. Also, when you sleep, you reduce your cortisol, and so that reduces further catabolic or tissue breaking down processes.
Yeah. And so, like, when you have some sort of tissue injury, there's little enzymes and chemicals that are being released at the tissue site that are carried throughout your systemic circulation that are saying, like, hey, you're injured. So when you have that extra growth hormone, and you have those circulating chemicals saying, hey, you're injured, it's more likely to injure or heal those injured tissues because you're sleeping longer. So, yeah, sleep is also key.
Yeah, and so I think we'll just finish off here with some tips for people if they have like itching in their wound. It's important to not itch the wound. Instead, you want to find like a low alcohol lotion to keep it hydrated, so that you can maybe relieve the itch without debriding the healthy tissue off the wound bed.
Yeah. And then another thing I would say we haven't touched is depending on if it's an open wound and how you got the open wound, I would highly consider some sort of like antibacterial ointment, because it's less stress that your body has to overcome whenever it's fighting foreign bodies, like especially if it's like road rash or some sort of injury where you got it outside in some sort of dirty environment. The more you can help your body combat that, the easier it's going to be for your tissues to heal.
Yeah, we want to make the healing process as seamless as possible, because any of these processes, if there is an obstruction, can be delayed into a chronic state, which we want to avoid. Yeah, what else? We have dressing changes, and to apply the dressing, we also learn distal to proximal.
Yeah.
So if you're wrapping your leg, you want to start at the ankle and go up to your knee. That means distal is further away, proximal is closer to your body. And if you're wrapping your fingers or your toes, you want to wrap each digit independently to squeeze compression, and also to...
So for the distal to the proximal, you're doing that so that the compression pattern is going up towards your heart, getting that fluid back to your systemic circulation. For your digits, the reason why you do each one individually is because if you wrap them together and you have injuries on, say you have an injury on this side and an injury on this side, and you close it, like we talked about before, if you have skin tissue coming together, if you have they can't tell the difference between the skin cells of two different fingers, so they'll actually start growing together. And
Really?
yeah,
That's nuts.
It's wacky stuff, dude. But like I said, it can't tell the difference, and it's just gonna sense. Oh, I found skin tissue. We're done healing, and then just grow back together. So that's why you keep them separated.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, you'll have to wrap your digits independently for that reason, because you don't want to have one massive finger, right? Also, I think we should finish a little bit talking through what not to do. So we went over what's good, so what's bad. So letting the wound air out. This is old wives' tale, no longer science supported. You want to keep the wound moistened with an occlusive bandage, and also nicotine, because it's a vasoconstrictor. So this is unfortunate for those who are smokers. You really want to avoid drugs that vasoconstrict your tissues, because you're preventing oxygen in the blood flow getting into your wound.
Yeah. One thing I think I would harp on is frequent dressing changes. If you're doing it more than that 24 hours, what you're doing is not only are you exposing it more to the environment, but you're doing two other things. You're more likely to take off that new tissue that's forming, and then you're cooling the skin every time you expose it to the environment. Like you wanted to keep it warm. If you're cooling it down multiple times a day, your body's going to have to work harder to heal that tissue injury. There's one more thing. The use of antibiotics. I would typically, if you need them, use them. Don't use them every single time that you have to reapply a dressing, because yes, it's going to kill like bad bacteria, but it's also likely going to kill good cells. And you're trying to maintain good cells, not kill the good cells. You want to maintain those good cells. So if you're using that every single time, you're just going to end up with chronic inflammation.
Right, yeah. So I guess a good way to say it is to go see a physician if you think you need to use antibiotics.
Yeah.
Because even as physical therapists, we cannot diagnose an infection. That has to be done with a microscope, I believe.
I think it's like a biopsy.
A biopsy. I think it's 1 gram of tissue is like 1 times 10 to the 5th.
Or you can use what's called a culture. Like you just dab it with a Q-tip or something. And they determine what bacteria is on it, but it's not as good as the tissue biopsy.
Right. As a gold standard.
Right. We can see the signs of infection.
Yellow wound, black wound, infection, the smell.
But you can't actually diagnose an infection unless you've done one of those tests.
Alrighty. Well, you have anything else, Mr. John?
I think we got everything.
We've arrived to the end of the track, so we'll see you guys next time.